So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the AltiusHub podcast. I'm Abram Vijay Kumar, co-founder of AltiusHub, a comprehensive traceability product for the pharmaceutical supply chain. At AltiusHub, we help manufacturers, 3PLs, retailers, wholesalers, and distributors, and anyone in the supply chain cut through the complexity of drug traceability compliance from DSCSA to EU FMD to UAE Tatmeen to CIS countries, you name it. We built AltiusHub on one conviction: compliance shouldn't be a black box. The more informed you are, the better decisions you make. And that's exactly why this podcast exists. This is episode 1, the first of many conversations where we democratize the knowledge of pharma traceability. No spin, no vendor narratives, just honest, expert conversations that help you make informed decisions. Today's topic is one that's been sitting in the room for a long time without anyone calling it out directly, which is L4 data migrations, specifically busting the myths around L4 data migrations and anything with regards to its control, compliance, and the reality around. Because in my experience, the moment you bring up these L4 migrations in any conversation with enterprises, large organization, the temperature in the room changes. Fear kicks in. And I want to really understand with the right people how much of that fear is real and how much of it has been manufactured. To do that, I have two of the best in the business with me today. Justin Ahdan, whose work spans across the EU, UK, and interoperability frontier of pharma traceability, and Scott Pugh, one of the sharpest minds in DSCSA in the US market. These are two gentlemen who are actively shaping the modern narrative of how pharma traceability should be done. Justin and Scott, welcome to this podcast. Really glad to have you both here. For the next 1 hour, I'm going to steer this conversation into the places that need to be talked, the uncomfortable questions, the real world gaps, and what good actually looks like. But before I do that, I know I might have not done the real justice to introduce Justin and Scott to a larger audience. So you can spend a quick 1 minute to hear it from you guys.
Go ahead, Justin.
So I'm Justin Ahdan, customer champion at Ankero. I've specialized in aligning technology and businesses for over 25 years, and that's spanned various industries and various sectors. And for the past 7-8 years, serialization, and I found a common partner in crime, Scott Pugh at Jennison, some time ago. So serialization is relatively new to me compared to most people, but yes, at Ankero we specialize in serialized operations.
I'm Scott Pugh. And thank you, Avi, for inviting us to be on the podcast today. Quick background about myself. I'm 17 years in total in the serialization space. That's spanning across a few different roles, most of which are in the consulting capacity. Last 13 years have been operating through my company, Jennison. I'd say we primarily support the manufacturer segment, whether that's manufacturers, CMOs, 3PLs, but have done work in other segments as well. Again, most of the work I consider advisory consulting, so it can be anything from helping companies who are just starting their serialization journey, if they're, let's say, pre-commercial, launching a first product and needing sort of the full set of understanding and capabilities, to probably, especially more recently, obviously helping companies who may have put in systems years ago. Now, here in the US and obviously many other markets are under full enforcement, and that can change a lot of understandings and expectations from an operational standpoint. So I think a lot of the recent work has definitely focused on helping companies who, again, may have been doing this for years, but only now are really starting to understand the importance of having the right systems and processes in place, because, again, all of this needs to work once enforcement becomes a reality.
Thank you, Scott. Awesome. So what I'll be doing next is steering this conversation basis a few anchor points. And to begin with, right, I would just like to understand from you, the moment we start talking about the L4 data migrations, and specifically when a customer starts exploring better solutions out there from a traceability product perspective, there is a hesitation, there is that discomfort, there is that fear. Scott, this question to you, basis your experience, what exactly is triggering these responses?
I think the important part to start might be even going, a step or half a step back, in that for a company to even get to the point where they are going to even consider looking at alternative systems, that's very challenging, right? For a lot of companies even to get to that stage, which I think is due to a few reasons that then also sort of continue on through as they start to look at what would really be the effort, the cost that would go into actually migrating systems. We've said in other avenues, other forums, it's all about the point in time when companies feel enough pain. And that pain usually comes in some form of financial pain, and is what we are definitely seeing more of, especially here in the US now with DSCSA being fully enforced. You're starting to see where companies understand and realize the direct ties between, if serialization doesn't work, I now have real financial pain that can come from that. Could be in the form of return shipments, canceled orders, things of that nature, even pure loss of business from certain customers if the manufacturer is not able to, really maintain its a high level of operation with enforcement in place. So as companies start to feel those pain, and as they start to realize in many cases it can be tied back to their serialization system, then they're going to get to that stage where they'll at least start to entertain the thought of switching platforms. And I think once you then get to that stage, right, there is also some pretty significant hurdles to overcome, at least historically. Justin and I have talked about this. We kind of put them into two categories, right? I think there's a set of hesitations that might fall into just more experiential and perception. And then there are hesitations that can be, I think, directly equated to real, technical challenges that have existed, again, historically with doing data migrations. The first one, right, those hesitations that are basically people looking at what their experience was probably implementing their first serialization system, seeing that it might have taken a very long time, it might have cost a lot, it might have taken a lot of resource support, and immediately thinking to themselves, I don't want to have to go through that whole experience again. Even if I'm feeling pain, right, is that pain greater than what I know from experience it took to get the first system implemented? The challenge with that is there's so many companies out there who their first experience implementing a system is not the same if they were to move to, quite honestly, more mature, right, more robust and capable platforms. So they're immediately making assumptions that what I had to go through in the past, I would have to do again. And that's the first thing we have to overcome. And I think just through education, right, is to say, look, you might have had a tough time getting your first system implemented, but that's not how it's going to be with going to probably what would be a more modern, again, more capable solution and vendor in a new system. So that's, again, one of the first hard parts, of just getting over that past experience and making them hopefully realize and understand it doesn't have to be that difficult going forward, right? So that's more the experiential side. The technical piece of it, right, is yes, there is absolutely pure technical work that has to be done as part of a data migration, clearly, right? We have to, at a minimum, get the necessary data sets from your legacy system into your now new system. You may also have other data sets coming out of your legacy system that are going to have to be archived somewhere, if not directly going into your new system. So there is admittedly a lot of planning, a lot of upfront work. What are the exact data sets that we're targeting? What are we going to do with each data set? And then, of course, there's the execution piece, right? Of, okay, now I need to understand how am I going to actually get the data out of my old system? Am I going to need to do anything to that data? Because that's another huge hurdle for a lot of companies out there. Many companies, many manufacturers, right, are using systems where that data literally does not exist in any kind of standard format, right? It's proprietary format. So the notion of just simply taking what you get out of your legacy and moving it over to your new system, it's not always a straight line, right? There often might be some things you need to do to that data to get it to the new platform. And then, of course, it's maybe the biggest piece and the biggest hurdle of all is, now that I've put this historical data into my new system, how can I guarantee that what I have in my new system exactly matches what I originally took from my legacy system? And those are a lot of the pieces that Justin and I have been directly addressing more recently, so that we can essentially eliminate those technical challenges as a hurdle or burden for companies that are interested to move to new platforms.
Uh, on that, I think, Justin, since you're running Anchero and actively helping customers migrate away from all these legacy system, I think all these points that Scott just mentioned, you must be the first person, getting all these arguments to fight, all these pain points to tackle. So when you go out there, speak to customers, and and offer them a solution to smoothly perform this data migration, how do you strengthen this narrative? How do you strengthen that, hey, look, these are not your traditional, your ERP or CRM based data migration. This is a much more methodical, a much more doable process. So how do you convince the customer? How do you remove that fear out of them?
I think I'd only be echoing what Scott was saying. I mean, that fear itself, it is attached to perceived risks. But I think that in most cases, customers would either be in a position where they've determined themselves they need to migrate, right? Or they're in such pain that providing examples of how they can do it, or even references of customers that we've worked with that have already done it, that adds a lot to giving them that confidence. It's kind of like having a phobia, right? And it's working through that, and that's a confidence building thing. And again, it's that experiential aspect that Scott alluded to at the beginning, and being familiar with a new reference, because that original reference is almost like a psychological scar that you have to kind of be patient and work through. But as I said, I think customers fall into two category groups. They'll be either logically positioned themselves to say, we need to move, we need to migrate, and we know why we need to do this. And it's relatively straightforward for us to have those technical conversations, to have those commercial conversations and so forth. But it's definitely a lot more of a slower burn with customers who have those fears, and you have to provide example demonstrations of how we can do it. We understand the pain and suffering they go through, the challenges they face, right? To access data, for example, what kind of cutover? What does a cutover point mean to them? How would we move data from going from one line system to a new level 4 and downstream? So we have a lot of experience working with that, and obviously the other teams that would be involved in that supply chain process, we engage with as well. And equally, their fears may be allayed. And then when they group together, I suppose they share a common response to what Scott and I provide evidence against those fears, I suppose, that can be removed.
Got
Yeah.
that. Got that. No, absolutely. In fact, let's take this conversation a bit deeper and close to the home, right? Both of you are sitting in geographies which perceive traceability regulations in very different ways. We have, Scott, you coming from the Drug Supply Chain Security Act perspective, where the guidelines are so comprehensively laid out and very clear enough to communicate to a stakeholder that what exactly needs to be followed. And Justin, you're sitting in the European realm, where EU FMD exists as a as a smooth cloud-based system out there which seeks certain standards of reporting to be achieved to them, and basis that they determine the level of compliance or they determine the level of traceability regulations for these anti-counterfeiting methods. So on the ground, right, fundamentally data migration is totally different. If you think from an EU FMD perspective, there kicks in a certain infrastructural shift. On the other hand, in the US court, we are moving from an infrastructure which need not really be carried forward. So can you focus a bit more on the on this part, on the regulatory side of things? Maybe Scott, if you can enlighten us with what migration looks like in the DSCSA realm.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the clear difference between, let's say, a DSCSA type regulation and something like FMD, it obviously starts with just the model. I think, as you were alluding to, right? DSCSA very much a track and trace model. So that inherently means there is simply more. There's more integrations. There's more. I'll use the term events, right, to try to stay standards based, right? There's more events that essentially are involved and included when we're dealing with a track and trace data model versus FMD, right, which is more the sort of serialize and authenticate. So for manufacturers, it's still, I need to know everything I serialize, but then you have obviously reporting up to the hub. You don't necessarily have at least the required, point-to-point exchange of data from a traceability model standpoint. What interestingly though, right, there is still overlap, I would say, and some pretty important overlap between the data migration needs in a track and trace model versus a kind of more serialized authenticate like FMD. And again, if we're speaking specifically for manufacturers, that all comes down to, step number one, it's batch and lot data, right? I mean, that's always going to be a given if we're talking about effectively a full migration from a legacy L4 system to a new L4 system. Everything starts with that lot or batch data, right? And so there are obviously ways and things that we've developed recently where, of course, we're going to focus first and foremost on how do we get that batch and lot data, again, from legacy system into new system. And that's going to be applicable whether you're an FMD, focused customer, whether you're a DSCSA focused customer, or quite honestly, I think you can safely say any other regulation that's out there, right? Because it's always going to start with batches or lots. From the DSCSA side, then yes, there are then additional data sets that we would typically need to look at just to ensure a comprehensive migration of data from legacy to new. That really gets more into the shipment or transaction data, as well as what we'll kind of generically call end of life data, right? So the scenarios where products have been removed from the supply chain for whatever the reason may be. And so that's a key part, again, of what goes into any data migration is going to be step one. What's the plan? Let's go through all of these data sets. We need batch data. We need shipment or transaction data. We need end of life data. And then for each of those data sets, we need to identify where are we getting the data from? What are we going to have to do to that data, right? Are we going to have to transform it from a proprietary format into a standard format? How are we going to load it into the new system? And then again, going back, probably the most important, do we guarantee that exactly what's been loaded into the new system exactly matches the old system? Because quite honestly, that piece of it, that sort of validation or verification piece of it, historically has probably been the thing that takes the most time and the most effort to do, because there just haven't been sort of purpose-built tools to help in those areas, which again is what Justin and I have addressed with some recent developments. Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental difference is probably one of perception, I guess, with what people think they need to migrate. And because in Europe, we only have that verification model, whereas in the US, you have that track and trace, that all the supply chain data is relevant. There isn't that same emphasis placed in Europe. However, when you're actually doing a migration, you still need to have that batch and lot data. So you would still need to be able to get your because we don't have aggregation. I mean, you could be doing Russia, for example, you've got aggregation, you may be aggregating for logistic purposes, but you still need to get that COM information, that ship information to record the events that took place when that batch was reported to the authority. So everything else is pretty much the same as Scott said, other than that perception that, oh, well, I don't have to worry about my supply chain data or anything like that, which is largely true in the sense of after they've done that initial shipment, but there's still that core event data that would need to be considered as something that has to be migrated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hold on to that thought, Justin, because, and if I could add to both of your point of views. So for data migration to happen, there are two things that we really focus on. One is the actual migration from the infrastructure point of view, which I think both of you have, very confidently laid out that there is a method to the madness. And historically, there exists a method to the madness, which every, maybe serialization or IT professional will follow to the T. Right now, the big question comes to the data retention part of it, right? And Justin, I would like to know from you, basis your conversation, because we are also and that's what we're discussing here, right? We're busting a few myths here. So I see that myth number one as a discussion point emerging, which is, how is data retention being, cleverly merged into this narrative of keeping data in the original system, right? Because I'm not seeing anywhere where compliances are explicitly asking your customers to stick to a specific interoperable solution.
That would be a very expensive option if you had to maintain your old system to retain your data. No, companies can archive their data. So there should be a retention period, definitely. There are different roles. I mean, MAHs absolutely want to retain their data. Some vendors do retain data. Some vendors put it behind a paywall to extract the data. But yeah, fundamentally, data retention, if anything, that question raises the importance of making sure that you retain your data. But it's a complete myth that you need to retain your legacy level for. It's a complete myth.
And I would just add to that to me, that would be the first clear sign of a very good sales job, maybe by the legacy vendor in convincing a client or a customer who's leaving them, right, for a new system. If they had convinced them to say, well, you have to keep us for some period of time because we have your data, that, as Justin said, that's an absolute myth, right? I can certainly speak from DSCSA, and I'm quite confident in probably saying it aligns with most, if not all, other global regulations, which is the concept of data retention is you have to have, the required data in some format, but certainly in DSCSA, and I'm sure in others, it never says anywhere that you have to have that historical data in a serialization system, right? It may not be the preferred method from a quality standpoint and other internal controls, but, to give an example, a spreadsheet export of a certain data set is just as valid to meet data retention requirements as it is that data living in a legacy serialization system. So yeah, certainly if that's a belief, or that's a common belief, it is definitely a myth. But I guess to maybe go to the core point, again, one of the key reasons why doing planning upfront as part of any migration is a must-have step, right? I mean, there is no way to get around doing comprehensive planning prior to this kind of migration. And again, that's where literally going through every single data set and making a determination, what do I need to do with that data set? Do I need to export it at all from legacy? Do I need to export it and migrate it to my new system, or do I need to export it and put it to an archive location? And something we try to strive for with clients that we've worked with, but it's at the end of the day, it's entirely up to the client's decision. We like to at least make sure that historical data exists in two different places post-migration. So oftentimes, even let's say, for example, if we're going to migrate historical batch data, clearly we're going to migrate that to the new system. We can also say and can also recommend that that historical batch data exist in a more raw format that is then archived, in a quality controlled file share or something to that effect, right? It's not a must that you always have to have at least two sets of the data. Again, there's no regulation that calls for that. That's just more kind of best practice from an internal quality standpoint. The bottom line and the key part, of course, and where really most of the primary focus is making sure that the data we absolutely have to get into the new L4 system, that again, we're defining exactly how we're going to get it, what we need to do with it, how we're going to load it, and then how we're going to validate that it matches what we originally exported from the old system.
I'm going to slightly pivot into, a realm which is just next to this, which is the ownership of this data precisely. Now, to me, data ownership in the conversations that I'm having with a lot of customers, in the industry, is coming from two perspectives. One, traceability data, the data that goes into traceability reports, the one that gets reported, right? It is generated in a traceability product, of course, right? So there is this. I really take fun in calling this as a ship of Theseus paradox. That if data is being generated in an L4 system, does the data belong to the customer or the L4 system, right? That's one part of it. And then, of course, then it's the realm of ownership of a data from the stakeholder in the supply chain perspective. Now, if you look at the largest spectrum of things, manufacturers manufacture from one corner of the globe. It gets shipped by a 3PL, reaches a certain warehouse, goes to a large distributor, and eventually retailers, right? So there are multiple exchange of hands for that data. So if you can throw some light on this aspect of data ownership, specifically starting with the ownership of a data for a customer from, where it is hosted in an L4, whether an L4 can claim that, look, we have generated this data for you, so let us take care of it. DSCSA asked us to take care of it for 7 years. So, you have to pay us to maintain it for 7 years. Or, the customer can say, no, that data belongs to me, so why should I pay? So if you can throw some light on it, and of course, throw some light on the supply chain side of things.
Yeah, Justin, I feel like this is definitely a good topic. You want to speak to maybe the contracting side, which we've experienced with some clients?
Well, I mean, yeah, okay, yeah. Well, so firstly, data is a commodity, and it's a commodity that belongs to the customer, the person who generates that data, right? It's theirs. So, to the contract point, what you'll find is with some vendors, is a very vague aspect, or it's a very vague description around the ownership of data and the accessibility to that data, right? Now, looking at data itself and understanding the importance of its value, if you're using a vendor where, firstly, it's very difficult to access that data, that's the first red flag, right? If you need to engage with the vendor to access the data, that's the second red flag, right? If in order for you to manage your data for your operations, which you can do quite easily in your ERP or your CRM, and you rely on third parties to show you how to manage your data in your system, you are very much in a position where your data has been imprisoned, right? And I know it sounds like a really cynical view of how it is, but that's based on experience and reference of how, because the whole point of digitizing data is to make it simpler, right? Is to give you control, right? That's why we move from analog data to digital data. So if you're actually saying, oh, yes, I agree, right? Supply chains are very complex, but the systems that manage them and the data that underpins those systems shouldn't be that complicated. That's the whole point of digitizing. And there are references, there are examples where you can see this. So data ownership is something that is a responsible thing, right? And it shouldn't be behind a paywall. It shouldn't be difficult to access. So as I said, they're red flags. If you cannot access or manage your data easily, that's not a good sign. And as I said, there are examples where you can see that it's much easier to do those things. And one of the reasons why Scott and I have obviously worked towards Exodus is not just to simplify taking data from one system to a new system, but being able to move your data wherever you want, right? And having complete and utter control over it instead of, I use the term in prison, but yeah, I think that's the only way I can describe how it is for some customers and their serialization data. It's literally imprisoned by tiers of paywalls.
And so, and I'll just add quickly. So the contracting point, I think that's an action that every manufacturer should probably be doing literally right after this podcast, right? Is going back to their serialization vendor contract and really understanding both the data ownership piece of it, which 100%, just like Justin said, that should never be a question. Data is owned by the customer, right? The vendor should have no ability to claim any kind of ownership over the data just because it happens to be in their system. So ownership, I think, is clear. But again, kind of building off what Justin said, the accessibility piece is what really every manufacturer should be looking at their contract to understand in any situation. Obviously, a clear one being if you were going to terminate the contract and move to a new provider, what are you guaranteed per your contract with the vendor in terms of how they'll support you in getting your data out of the system? And exactly like Justin said, it is not by coincidence at all that the sort of first wave and first phase of development that we've done on these recent tools to help automate data migration focuses on getting data out of platforms that are historically the hardest to access your data in, right? Because that did and has, again, historically presented one of those technical perceptions and challenges, right? Which is, I know on a day-to-day basis, it's very hard for me to even get to simple access to my data. I can't even imagine what it would be if I now had to go about the task of getting all of my historical data out of my system. Again, that is very real for some platforms. Like Justin said, that should be an immediate red flag. And that is also why we focused a lot of our initial attention on helping specifically, getting data out of those systems that it's historically been hard to.
Scott, Justin also mentioned about Exodus. So if you can, slightly give a real life example of how have you deployed this methodology? How does, in maybe at a broad level, how does this entire data migration happen as a process? And how do you, get it done via Exodus? Maybe that also would love to know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the origin, if you will, for the concept of Exodus came about in the same way as I would say most other solutions that we've collaborated on and developed over the past few years, which is it comes through customer demand, plain and simple, right? I mean, this is definitely not a situation where we said, hey, let's go off and build a solution and just hope that there's people out there that need it, right? I mean, I can certainly say from the Jennison side, I know it's the same from the Ankuro side. The easiest way, if you will, to go about determining what may be good candidates to build solutions around is just look at what you're being asked for. And so it happened enough with Justin and I that we got asked enough about doing data migrations and focusing on specific platforms that we said, look, this isn't something that we want to just carry out as a pure consulting service every time. There would be significant value and benefit to looking at what are all of the pieces we can automate through the whole data migration process, and let's go build a tool that can do that. And so that's what we did, right? Is we essentially developed a solution, which I'll say, at least to our knowledge, is the first of its kind out there. Again, very purpose built and focused on the concept of moving and performing serialization data migrations from a legacy system to a new system. The one other important piece I'll say about this, though, is we still approach this and Exodus as overall being a service, right? I think it is still very important to set expectations correctly and appropriately, that, you know, data migrations are never going to get to the point where you literally click one button and everything happens from start to finish. Like I've been saying multiple times, the very first step is a planning step. There are, interestingly, pieces of that planning step that we have actually automated through Exodus, but there's always going to be a service aspect to it, largely because, as we have all experienced working in pharma, every company is going to have slight differences in expectations from a quality and validation standpoint. And so for as much as we can try to automate around the technical pieces, even some of the planning and documentation pieces, there's always going to be those variances. You know, some customers might require more protocols, more documentation. So there's always going to be a service layer. So how we approach it from the Ankiro and Jennison side, right, is it's really a service offering that Exodus is a tool that supports that service offering.
Awesome. I'll just hold on to one point which you said in terms of calling out precisely what is the reality, right? And I just want to, step into the shoes of a supply chain VP or a CXO maybe, and, and ask you the real question. What am I getting into by doing this migrations? Is my data safe? Will I have access to them for a foreseeable future? Will there be an incident where, let me pull up the geopolitical scenarios right now. There have been scenarios where AWS data center got, exploded in the Middle East, and a lot of data loss happened to not many other vendors, fortunately not in the traceability realm, right? Now, these are raising real questions. What if things like that happen, right? These are real risks. So if I step into the shoes of a supply chain VP, a CIO, or a CXO, typical of an enterprise, right? These are the customers that I'm dealing with here. They ask these questions, fine, you have all these ways, method to the madness, but please, as conscious vendors, help me call out the real risks of data migrations. What would that be?
You're good, Justin. I'll go through a couple.
No,
of
go. I mean, we. No. We were talking about this yesterday, right?
I kept this question open because I just want input from the both of you, so anyone can start.
No, we were talking about this yesterday, right? So, and you started off saying about the two different separate groups anyway. So, I mean, so from I think the way I always look at things is business lens first, right? And I can understand that there's risk, and projects are about managing risk, right? Fundamentally. So I think that in any case like that, there are benefits. You have to weigh up your benefits. So you have to have your benefit analysis and understand, well, why am I making this change? What am I going to get from this change, right? There can be technical improvements, but from a business, there's always the opportunity of improving my bottom line as well, right? So I think there are different benefits that need to be weighed up against those risks, firstly, yeah? So I would say identify the benefits of what the change would bring and balance that against the risk. The experiences and the references that people have access to can help support making that decision as well. So I would always say that if there's a risk, the first thing is, well, how can I mitigate that risk, and what benefit can I gain from that mitigation?
Yeah, and what I would add to that, exactly to that point, right, is we, again, coming at this as a sort of service layer with tools that support underneath, we approach any data migration literally no different than any system implementation, right? So it's going to have the full set of documentation surrounding it, right? It's going to have the full set of validation and qualification activities surrounding it. The tools itself, right, will have their own set of validation and documentation surrounding it. So we're going to go through usually multiple stages of testing of the actual data migration before we do it into the true production environment. So planning documentation up front, configuration and design specifications in the scenarios where there needs to be any sort of transformations to data that's performed, which is quite often for a lot of companies, right? That's all going to be detailed out in those kind of documents. Again, multiple stages of informal testing of the data migration activities itself. At least one formal qualification testing that'll be captured in a data migration protocol, right? So running through, literally performing the data migration in test environments and documented with evidence, and then repeating that process in a formal production data migration protocol, right? With any then necessary summary reports. And again, that's kind of where it can differ from one company to the next, right? Whatever is going to be needed to meet their quality requirements and expectations. But again, I mean, we approach it, even though a lot of times, of course, data migration is going to be grouped into probably the broader, just overall project that's managing the move from the old system to the new system. The data migration piece absolutely has to exist as, at a minimum, its own work stream, if not also seen as essentially its own project. Because there are enough activities and tasks and responsibilities just in that data migration work stream that warrant it, right, being its own work stream or its own project. Now, having said all of that, again, I think it is now important to come back and say, again, historically, when people looked at that, and even if you take what I said word for word, that a data migration is its own work stream or its own project, that's where the fear started. This is too big. This is too much. I can't take it on. I don't want to spend the time, the money, right? But to Justin's point, it all goes back to, if you've now felt enough pain, the data migration piece of it is one of those sort of unfortunate necessities that have to be done in order to get you ultimately to where you want to go, which is a better system that's going to reduce that pain, again, which should also translate into probably cost savings, things of that nature, not having as much financial impact from the pain you're currently feeling on your current system. And so, again, that's why we developed sort of the Exodus service and tools, so that we could address what has historically been understood to be, its own work stream. And again, try to automate that as much as possible. Automate planning documentation, obviously automate the execution of the testing of actually getting the data, transforming it, loading it, and validating, right? Reconciling that everything matches. Being able to automate, running through qualification protocols, and then of course automating as much as we can running through the actual production protocols as well. So everything still at the end, at the output, if you will, you still have that full set of documentation that you would expect to have like any other system implementation. It's just that, again, we've introduced automation in as many places as we can, so that we can bring down and reduce down the actual effort needed to something that is more than obtainable, feasible, achievable to do, and does not have to be this, barrier number one to a company even considering, doing a migration to a new system.
Very well said, Scott. And if I could add one point to that, to a lot of my customers, what I'm doing is giving them the assurance that their BAU is unaffected, their operations are unaffected. The fact that your shop floor activities are ongoing on a traceability platform, and we have a very meticulous plan in place without stopping that, and then have very smoothly transitioning into the next system, with all of the points that both of you just said, gives them a lot of comfort. Uh, I have a couple of more questions, and just to add a bit more spice to it, AI is going crazy. Both of you must know that people are now clouding it out. So, Justin, Scott, how are you leveraging this to your own strength?
I mean, I use
I
it to do
mean,
my daily recipes for dinner every week. That's a big use of AI for me on a daily basis. Sorry, go ahead, Justin.
no, I've been using it to like help me build a new table in the garage.
I, so to more formally, I think, address your question, I'll be right. So, as it may sound maybe a bit backwards, at least in the current landscape, I can comfortably and confidently say, at least specifically in regards to what we've built with Exodus and as a service and sort of supporting tools, not leveraging AI in those solutions. And I don't say that because there isn't opportunity or possibility to somehow incorporate the use of AI into those services or capabilities. But I think for a lot of the reasons, as you described, Avi, right, in terms of at the end of the day, doing a migration to a new system is going to have to rise up to a probably very high level within an organization, right? And it's going to ultimately sit with a person or a small group of people to make that final decision of either, yes, we're going to go ahead with this, or no, we're not going to go ahead with that. In that understanding that that's going to be the typical mindset, in the services and tools that we leverage to support companies in doing those data migrations, at least today, again, not saying it can't change in the future, but today, I wouldn't even actually want to introduce the potential additional risk of saying that there's AI components to the service and solutions that we're going to leverage, right? I almost feel like to try and ease the concerns of understandably the people who might be hesitant and have reservations about, I'm really nervous about this whole migration process and my data is going to be moving and it's going to be, have things touching my data. I would rather have a tried and true solution, right? That doesn't introduce any of the variability or unknown, I guess, of AI at this stage, and rather just stick to very much here's how it comes out of point A, here's what happens to it, here's how it's going to go into point B, and here's how we're going to check that those two things exactly match, right? Because all of that can be done very feasibly without AI. Again, would love to have those opportunities and have ways to use it potentially in the future, but it's just not something that I think we're not getting people coming to us saying, hey, can you help us with our data migration? And man, I really hope it's all driven by AI. Nobody has that thought right now.
Oh, very well said. Justin?
absolutely agree. I mean, AI is great. It's relevant. It's going to become more relevant over time. But as Scott said, at this stage in what we're doing, there's no place for it. It would just add noise. It would add a level of complication that isn't necessary. So at this current time, AI is not. It's not necessary to do what we need to do.
No, and gentlemen, let me also add my vote into it, right? I also fundamentally believe that now is definitely not the right time to have AI in these set of operations, precisely because these are data pertaining to regulations, these are data pertaining to compliance. No, smart CXO, no smart team in the world would want to risk their data and any operations associated with it by putting an AI layer over it. Because what we need right now is expertise, human intelligence, human expertise who have seen first-hand supply chain operations, right? I also fundamentally believe that in the realm of regulatory data and its management and its movement, AI is not ready yet. But I do fundamentally also believe that we can ease our own lives to maybe achieve some sort of time savings, to achieve some sort of efficiencies. Maybe in your own steps of migration, club those 5 steps into one, and before the regulatory layer, and ensure that yes, we are still giving the best to our customers basis intelligence. So my vote is also with you guys. Awesome. So I think a last couple of minutes, Justin Scott.
Just I was going to say as well, just sorry to just bring back that last subject about AI. When you talked about the supply chain, I think one of the main reasons why we don't need AI right now in the supply chain is because the supply chain has an issue with data standards, right? So that would probably be one of the main reasons why certainly Scott and I would say, well, let's not focus on AI. Let's focus on sorting out the data first. So I think that would probably be one of the key reasons why AI isn't suitable in the supply chain right now, to analyze large quantities of data, perhaps to analyze where your supply chain data is failing, perhaps, but you want to make sure you've got a standards-based data infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure first before you implement AI. And I think that should be a rule of thumb when AI is implemented into the supply chain.
Well said. Well said. I agree. Right. With the last few minutes at hand, gentlemen, thanks to Vaishnavi for organizing this great podcast, and she has also put up a few, what do we call them, as rapid fire round for the both of you. Apparently, it's very popular with a lot of Indian talk shows. Apparently, so I'll just alternatively ask both of you, Justin, Scott, on this rapid fire. Your answer need to be, you just call it out as a myth or a reality. Awesome. So, Scott, first question to you. Under DSCSA, historical traceability data has to stay in the original L4 system forever. Myth or reality?
Pure myth.
Justin, migrating traceability data increases regulatory risk.
Myth.
Okay. Justin, proprietary data formats are necessary to manage and audit traceability data effectively.
Myth.
All right. Justin, CMOs are the contract manufacturers, typically have less long-term traceability data responsibility than MAHs, market authority holders.
Regulatory wise, true. Yeah, truth. Yeah, yeah.
But
Okay.
business wise,
Yes,
you don't know,
myth.
right? I mean, I think that's the key. Is it may not be regulatory driven for CMOs to retain, but they may have business agreements with their customers or their MAHs that dictate certain lengths of retention that could be even longer than regulatory requirements on the MAHs themselves. So sorry.
Yeah.
No, for sure. And that raises a good point, actually, that there should be an evolution or a maturity in the kind of technical agreements you have with your partners, right? Because there could be events that the CMO has taken that they haven't reported to the MAH. So that would be an example where it could be necessary. But yeah, in context of how you put it, it would be a myth.
Got that. Scott, EPCIS and GS1 based systems reduce long-term compliance risk by improving interoperability and investigation readiness.
100% true, and I'll maybe even take it one half step further, just real quickly to say the companies should be very aware if their traceability system can be considered a true product traceability platform, or is it just a serialization compliance platform? Because those two things are very different. And that might be a good segue into a whole separate podcast on that topic. But the key part is there are many, many manufacturers out there that are leveraging serialization compliance systems under the impression that it's a true product traceability system. And the challenge is a serialization compliance system, if it's purposely designed and architected to be one, cannot be a product traceability system. But a true product traceability system, one that is architected and designed that way, can also perform as a serialization compliance system. Again, that's a whole big topic to unpack, but that's maybe just a thinker for people out there.
Nope.
100%.
But quite succinctly put. Well said. And the last one to you, Justin, and you'll relate to this. Having a central hub like L5 reduces the long-term retention, data retention burden on L4 systems.
Miss.
Myth.
Yeah. I mean, you can't rely on the authority. I mean, you should have your own copy of the data. You should retain your own copy of the data for sure.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right. With that, the last minute, I think. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you so much, Scott, for being part of the maiden podcast of AltiusHub. And it was a great conversation. Great to have you both here. Great for a lot of our Indian customers, a lot of AltiusHub customers who are going to get a lot of awareness basis all the pointers that you said. And I'm positive that this podcast will lead to a lot of positive momentum in the market. Again, thanks a lot, gentlemen.
Thank you. I mean, brilliant. Honestly, across the world, America, UK, India, brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.